The desert stretched endlessly, a sea of golden sand dunes rippling beneath the unforgiving Egyptian sun. Heat shimmered in waves, distorting the horizon where ancient mountains of stone stood as silent sentinels to history. Amidst the vast, sun-baked landscape, a caravan of archaeologists trudged forward, their footsteps sinking into the hot sand. At the front of the group walked Professor Jonathan Drake, a man of intense focus and quiet obsession. He'd spent years chasing whispers of Pharaoh Neferkha's lost tomb, a place spoken of only in fearful, hushed tones by the locals. A man who, according to legend, had defied the gods themselves, cursing his tomb with a malevolent force that protected his secrets from the living. Another day, another mile, Professor Drake muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow as he squinted at the distant horizon. His heart beat with the thrill of discovery, pushing aside the weariness that weighed on his bones. This was it. He could feel it. Behind him, his colleagues moved with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Sarah Whitlock, the team's young linguist, clutched her journal with trembling fingers. Though her academic interest in ancient hieroglyphs had driven her to join this expedition, she couldn't shake the warnings the locals had given them back in Cairo. They say Neferkha's tomb is cursed, she had warned Professor Drake days before. That no one who disturbs his rest will escape his wrath. Drake had brushed her concerns aside. Stories meant to scare away fools and fortune seekers, he had replied with a dismissive wave. Yet even now, a small knot of unease had settled in the pit of his stomach, though he would never admit it. The caravan continued, led by their guide, Omar, a local who had grown quiet and withdrawn ever since they had neared their destination. He had spoken little since the journey began, but now, as they approached a towering cliffside where the sand seemed unnaturally still, he paused. His weathered face grew pale. "We have arrived," Omar announced, his voice a low murmur. He pointed toward a jagged crack in the cliff face, half obscured by creeping vines and windswept debris. "There, that is where the tomb lies." The group came to a halt, a nervous silence falling over them. The wind, which had once howled with relentless fury, died down to an eerie stillness. The entrance to the tomb loomed before them, a blackened gash in the stone, cold and uninviting despite the blistering heat of the desert. Professor Drake stepped forward, his heart pounding with anticipation. "This is it," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "The tomb of Neferkha." Omar muttered a prayer under his breath and refused to step any closer. "I will wait here," he said, his eyes wide with fear. "You must go alone. No one sane will follow you into that darkness." Drake barely heard him. He was already motioning for Sarah and the others to prepare the equipment. "We're going in," he said firmly, his voice breaking the fragile silence. Sarah hesitated. "Are we sure about this?" Her voice trembled slightly, but her sense of duty and curiosity kept her rooted in place. "The locals, they warned us for a reason." Professor Drake gave her a reassuring smile, though his own apprehension was gnawing at him. "Legends and superstition. We've come too far to turn back now." With that, he lit his torch and stepped toward the entrance, the flickering flame casting long shadows across the stone. The darkness within seemed to swallow the light, as if the tomb itself resisted their intrusion. Sarah and the others followed, their footfalls muffled by the thick, suffocating silence that greeted them. As they crossed the threshold, the air inside grew cooler, almost unnaturally so. The walls of the passage were carved with intricate symbols, faded with age, yet still sharp enough to evoke a sense of menace. Sarah traced her fingers along the markings, her mind racing to decipher their meaning. A shiver ran down her spine. These aren't just warnings," she whispered. "They're threats." Drake ignored her, his eyes fixed ahead. In the distance, the passage widened, revealing a vast chamber hidden deep beneath the earth. At its center, something gleamed faintly in the torchlight, the unmistakable outline of an ancient sarcophagus. "This is it," Drake breathed, his voice trembling with excitement. "The Pharaoh awaits." But as the group gathered in the chamber, a sudden gust of cold wind surged through the tomb, extinguishing their torches in an instant. Darkness fell over them, thick and impenetrable, as if the tomb itself had awoken to greet its intruders. And from deep within the shadows, something stirred. The darkness clung to them like a living thing, thick and stifling. Sarah's breath quickened, her hand instinctively reaching for the wall to steady herself as she blinked against the blackness. The sudden loss of light had shaken them all, but it was the silence that followed that truly unsettled her, an oppressive stillness, as if the tomb itself was holding its breath. "Everyone stay calm," Professor Drake's voice broke the silence, though it trembled ever so slightly. His torch was out, but he fumbled for matches, the faint scraping sound echoing in the chamber. A moment later, a flame sputtered to life, casting flickering light over their pale faces. "Calm," muttered James Merrick, their equipment specialist, his eyes wide as he relit his own torch. "We've barely stepped inside and already something doesn't feel right." Ignoring him, Drake raised his torch higher, illuminating the chamber. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, hieroglyphs that Sarah couldn't quite decipher from this distance. But what caught her eye, and everyone else's, was the sarcophagus in the center of the room. It stood on a raised platform, ornate and imposing, with gleaming golden trim that had miraculously survived the ravages of time. The face of Pharaoh Neferka was carved into its lid, his expression serene yet forbidding. His eyes, made of polished obsidian, seemed to stare directly at them. "This must be it," Drake whispered, awe seeping into his voice as he stepped forward, his torchlight dancing off the gleaming surface. "After all these years, we've found it." Sarah's stomach knotted as she watched Drake approach the sarcophagus. There was something deeply unsettling about the chamber, an almost palpable sense of foreboding that clung to the air. The hieroglyphs on the walls seemed more menacing than ceremonial, and though she couldn't fully read them from where she stood, fragments of the symbols jumped out at her mind, warning her with ancient urgency. "Wait!" she called out, her voice louder than she intended. Drake paused, turning to face her, his brow furrowed. "The symbols," she continued, taking a few cautious steps forward. "We should understand what they say before we do anything else." Drake sighed, but motioned for her to approach. Sarah moved closer, the light from her torch illuminating the carvings on the wall. She traced her fingers along the worn stone, her eyes scanning the symbols, piecing them together slowly. "Beware," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "For those who trespass upon this sacred ground shall awaken the wrath of the gods." She paused, feeling a chill creep down her spine. "The darkness that protects the Pharaoh shall devour the living, and none shall escape." A heavy silence fell over the group as her words hung in the air. Even Drake hesitated, his gaze shifting from the hieroglyphs to the sarcophagus. For a moment, doubt flickered in his eyes, but it quickly faded, replaced by the same relentless determination that had brought him here. "You've seen this kind of thing before," he said, his voice steady, though a trace of nervousness lingered beneath it. "Warnings, threats, it's meant to scare tomb robbers away." Sarah's mouth was dry as she shook her head. "This feels different," she murmured, her eyes lingering on the carved figure of Neferka, whose gaze seemed darker now, almost predatory. "This isn't just a curse, it's a warning, a promise." Drake let out a heavy breath. "We didn't come this far to turn back because of some old legend." He took another step toward the sarcophagus, running his hand along its smooth surface. "We need to examine it. We're on the verge of one of the greatest discoveries in modern archaeology." Sarah's heart pounded as she exchanged a glance with James, who shook his head in silent agreement with her unspoken fear. But Drake was already pulling out his tools, ready to pry the sarcophagus open. As the metal scraped against the stone, a low, almost imperceptible groan echoed through the chamber. It wasn't the sound of the stone itself, but something deeper, an ancient rumble that reverberated through the walls, like the distant growl of something awakening from a long sleep. Sarah's breath hitched as the lid of the sarcophagus slid open with a grinding sound. Inside, the figure of Neferka lay in repose, wrapped in linen, his form remarkably intact. For a moment, nothing happened, and the group gathered around the open tomb, peering down at the ancient remains. But then, a sudden gust of cold air swept through the chamber, snuffing out their torches once more. A deep, echoing moan filled the darkness, this time unmistakably real, rising from the very heart of the tomb. A voice, low and guttural, ancient and furious, whispered through the cold air, sending a chill down their spines. "You have disturbed my rest." And in that suffocating darkness, something moved. The moan echoed through the tomb, low and menacing, like the wind carrying a distant cry of agony. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, her fingers numb around the torch she struggled to relight. The flame flickered weakly, casting uneven shadows that danced along the stone walls, elongating the figures of her companions into grotesque shapes. "Did anyone else hear that?" James's voice trembled, his face pale beneath the glow of the newly lit torches. Sarah didn't need to answer. The fear in everyone's eyes made it clear. They had all heard it. Professor Drake, however, stood transfixed at the edge of the sarcophagus, his torch held high. His eyes were wide, but not with fear. He was mesmerized by what lay before him. The linen-wrapped remains of Pharaoh Neferka rested perfectly preserved, the cloth undisturbed by the passage of millennia. It should have been a triumphant moment for the professor. He had found the tomb of a forgotten king. But the air in the chamber seemed heavier now, oppressive and charged, as though something ancient and unspeakable had been stirred. "There's no logical explanation for this," Drake muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. "No drafts, no shifting stone. This isn't possible." But Sarah could feel it. The tomb was alive. Something unseen had awakened, something darker than just dust and decay. "We need to get out of here," Sarah whispered, her voice taut with panic. She glanced toward the entrance of the tomb, but the passageway now seemed like a dark maw, ready to swallow them whole. Drake shook his head, still in denial, refusing to tear his gaze from the sarcophagus. "We're on the brink of a major discovery. We can't just—" Before he could finish, a loud crack echoed through the chamber. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and small stones tumbled from the ceiling. The walls groaned, as if the very tomb resented their presence. And then, the linen around Neferka's body began to shift. James took a step back, his face draining of color. What is happening?" His voice was barely a whisper, his eyes wide with disbelief. The linens were moving, unraveling slowly, like invisible hands were peeling them away, releasing the ancient king from his eternal sleep. The scent of decay filled the chamber, thick and nauseating, though Neferka's body had appeared untouched by time. Professor Drake stumbled back, his face pale now, as if the reality of what was happening had finally pierced his academic detachment. It's just the air escaping, or—" Sarah shook her head, unable to tear her eyes away from the mummy. "This isn't natural," she whispered, her voice trembling. The words from the hieroglyphs she had read earlier returned to her in a flood. "The darkness that protects the Pharaoh shall devour the living." Suddenly, the last of the linen fell away, revealing Neferka's face, a face that should have been nothing more than a decayed husk. Instead, his eyes, hollow and black, opened. A collective gasp filled the room. Neferka's mouth twitched, lips peeling back in a grotesque imitation of a smile. His skin, leathery and taut, moved unnaturally, as if the bones beneath were shifting of their own accord. A low, rasping breath escaped the mummy's throat, a sound that should have been impossible after thousands of years of death. The black eyes turned toward them, glinting in the torchlight, filled with something far worse than rage, hunger. "You have come to claim my treasure," the voice boomed, though Neferka's lips barely moved. "But you will never leave this place alive." Panic gripped the group. Sarah stumbled back, colliding with James, who was now breathing erratically, his hands shaking as he fumbled for his tools. "What do we do?" he cried, his voice rising in hysteria. Drake, still frozen in place, seemed paralyzed by a mix of awe and terror. This can't be real," he whispered. "It's impossible." But it was real, more real than any of them had ever imagined. Neferka's body twitched again, and this time he rose slowly from the sarcophagus, his ancient joints creaking with the weight of centuries. As he stood fully upright, the very air in the chamber grew colder, the darkness around them deepening, as if the tomb itself had become a living entity, eager to claim them. Sarah grabbed Drake's arm, yanking him from his stupor. "We have to go now!" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the shock that had gripped him. But before any of them could move, Neferka's hand shot out with unnatural speed, clutching the edge of the sarcophagus, his head turning slowly to face them. His eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and the temperature in the chamber dropped even further. The wind howled through the entrance, as though summoned by the ancient king's will, and the heavy stone door that led to the outside world began to grind shut with a deafening thud. The group rushed toward the exit, their torches flickering wildly in the gusting wind. But as they ran, Neferka's laughter echoed through the tomb, a sound that promised they would never escape his wrath. The curse had been awakened. The sound of the stone door slamming shut reverberated through the tomb like a death knell. Sarah skidded to a stop, her heart racing as the heavy door sealed off their only exit, trapping them in the darkness. The air grew thick with dread, suffocating in its intensity. She could hear the panicked breathing of her companions behind her, their torches flickering weakly in the stale air. "We're trapped," James whispered, his voice barely audible over the heavy thud of the door. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. Professor Drake, his academic composure shattered, ran to the door and pounded against it with his fists. "No, no, this can't be happening," he shouted, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "We have to get out. His words were cut off as a loud, grinding noise filled the chamber. From behind them, a deep, guttural laugh echoed, a sound that crawled beneath their skin. Neferka stood at the center of the room, his rotted body impossibly animated, his black eyes glowing with an eerie green light that cast unsettling shadows across the walls. His presence filled the room with a dark energy that seemed to drain the warmth from their bones. "You cannot escape," Neferka's voice boomed, his ancient words reverberating in their minds more than their ears. He took a step forward, his limbs creaking with every movement. "You disturbed my rest, and now you will join me in eternal slumber." Sarah stumbled back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She had read about curses, about legends, but they had always been stories, superstitions meant to ward off grave robbers. But now, the reality of what they had unleashed was undeniable. The tomb had come alive with something ancient and malevolent. "We have to find another way out," Sarah said, her voice shaking. She grabbed Drake by the arm, pulling him away from the sealed door. "This place, it must have another exit." Drake looked at her, his eyes wild with fear and disbelief. "But the door is the only—" "Do you want to stay here and die?" Sarah snapped, her own fear fueling her urgency. "There has to be another way." James was already scrambling toward the opposite wall, his hands tracing the carvings, searching for any sign of a hidden passage. "These old tombs sometimes had secondary exits," he muttered, his voice tense. "There's gotta be something." The temperature in the room plummeted further, and the sound of Neferka's slow, deliberate steps echoed behind them. Sarah dared a glance back and felt a chill run down her spine as the Pharaoh's decayed figure moved closer, his mouth curling into a grotesque smile. James' hand suddenly froze on the wall. "Here," he shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. "There's something here, a seam in the stone." Drake rushed over, his hands joining James as they pushed against the wall. At first, nothing happened. But then, with a loud creak, a section of the stone shifted, revealing a narrow passageway barely wide enough for one person. Without a word, they rushed toward the opening, their torches bobbing wildly as they plunged into the narrow corridor. The walls pressed in on them, the air thick with dust and the stale scent of death. Sarah could feel the weight of the tomb bearing down on them, as though it were alive, tightening its grip with every step they took. Behind them, Neferka's voice rose in a haunting chant, the language ancient and guttural, but filled with power. The stone beneath their feet began to tremble, and Sarah could feel the energy of the curse swirling around them, growing stronger with every moment. "We need to move faster," James shouted, his voice echoing off the narrow walls. He turned a corner, only to be met with another long stretch of corridor. This has to lead somewhere. But as they hurried down the passage, the ground beneath Sarah's feet began to shift. The stones trembled, cracks spider-webbing across the floor. Without warning, the ground gave way beneath her. and she screamed as she plummeted into darkness. Her fall was short, the impact jarring as she hit the cold stone floor below. The wind was knocked out of her, but she was alive. Above, she could hear Drake and James shouting, their voices filled with panic. "Sarah, are you all right?" "I'm fine," she called back, though her heart was pounding in her chest. She scrambled to her feet, holding her torch high. The chamber she had fallen into was small, the walls lined with crumbling statues of gods whose faces had been worn away by time. The air was damp, colder than the tomb above, and an unsettling stillness clung to the space. Suddenly, a faint whisper filled the air, low and insidious. It wasn't coming from above. It was coming from within the chamber. Sarah's skin prickled with fear. The whisper grew louder, and she could almost make out the words, though the language was foreign. Then, from the corner of the room, something moved. A shadow, darker than the surrounding gloom, rising slowly from the ground. Her blood turned to ice. Above her, James was calling out, "We'll find a way to get you out. Just hold on." But Sarah wasn't sure she had time. The shadow twisted and writhed, taking form. And as it did, the same ancient, cold laughter that had haunted them since they entered the tomb filled the air once more. The curse was no longer contained to the tomb. It was coming for them all. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her torch flickering wildly as the shadow in the corner began to take form. Its shape twisted unnaturally, shifting between the vague outline of a person and something far more monstrous, its dark, formless limbs stretching toward her like the fingers of death itself. Cold terror gripped her chest as she backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The chamber around her seemed to close in, its air thick with the scent of decay and the echo of that horrible ancient laughter. The torch in her hand sputtered, casting feeble light that did little to push back the advancing darkness. "Sarah!" Drake's voice echoed from above, distant and frantic. "Hold on! We're coming for you!" But Sarah knew instinctively that no amount of digging would save her from what had been unleashed. Whatever this was, it was far older and far darker than any curse they could have imagined. She could feel it in her bones. The curse had followed them, had infected the very air around them. And now it was coming for their lives, their sanity. The shadow loomed closer, its shape flickering like a dying flame. As it neared, Sarah's mind was assaulted by a flood of visions, flashes of the past, of men and women, explorers and thieves who had ventured into the tomb long before her. She saw them succumbing to madness, their eyes wide with terror as they clawed at their own skin, desperate to escape something unseen. She could feel their agony, their horror, as though it were happening to her. The shadow's whispering voice filled her head. "Join them." It hissed, the sound slithering through her mind like cold, slick tendrils. "You disturbed my eternal rest. Now you will share their fate." She backed against the far wall, her heart racing, her mind screaming for escape. But there was no way out. The passage above was too far, and the thing in the room with her was growing more solid by the second. Its whispering grew louder, the foreign language becoming almost intelligible now, each word dripping with malice. Desperation took hold. Sarah raised her torch and swung it wildly in front of her, the weak flame casting fleeting bursts of light onto the shadow. But the thing only seemed to mock her efforts, shifting with ease around the flickering torch. Its cold laughter filled the chamber, rattling in her ears like the scraping of bones. Up above, Drake and James were shouting her name, the sound muffled by the ancient stone. She could hear them frantically working to find a way down, but their voices were becoming more distant, fading behind the pulse of the curse that thrummed in the air, drowning everything else out. The shadow lunged. In an instant, it wrapped around her, cold as death, tendrils of darkness piercing her mind. For a moment, the world vanished, replaced by a searing, overwhelming darkness that swallowed everything. She was no longer in the tomb. She was standing in a vast, endless void, surrounded by figures. Shadows like the one before her, only these were fully formed, their shapes familiar but terrifying, like twisted reflections of humanity. They whispered to her, voices from beyond time. She could feel their pain, their torment. These were the souls of those who had entered the tomb before, those who had failed to escape. "You are one of us now," they whispered, their voices a chorus of despair. "No!" Sarah's voice was a ragged shout in the void, but she couldn't break free. Her mind was cracking under the weight of the curse, her body frozen as the dark tendrils of the shadow coiled tighter around her, pulling her deeper into the cold abyss. Suddenly, a bright, flickering light burst into the chamber, blinding her in the darkness. A hand grabbed her wrist and yanked her out of the shadow's grasp. With a gasp, she was back in the tomb, her body collapsing to the stone floor. It was James. He had found a way down, and in his hand, he held a torch, the flame brighter than before, burning fiercely as though it had come alive in the presence of the shadow. "Sarah, get up," James shouted, pulling her to her feet. "We've got to get out of here." The shadow hissed in fury, retreating slightly, but not enough to be deterred. It hovered, waiting for its moment to strike again. "Where's Drake?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "He's trying to find another exit, but we don't have much time. This whole place is cursed. If we don't get out now, we're all dead." They turned to run, but as they did, the stone walls around them began to shift and groan. The tomb wasn't just cursed, it was alive, responding to Neferkah's wrath. The passage they had come through was collapsing behind them, the ceiling crumbling in chunks of stone and sand. Sarah's mind raced, her thoughts blurring with panic. The curse wasn't contained within the tomb, it had followed them. Even if they escaped this place, they would never be free of it. Neferkah's shadow would haunt them until it consumed their very souls. But there was no choice. They had to keep moving. They had to survive. Together they plunged deeper into the tomb, the relentless darkness chasing after them, and behind it, the haunting voice of Neferkah, whispering promises of their inevitable doom. "You cannot escape me." The narrow passage twisted downward into darkness, as though the tomb itself was dragging them deeper into the earth. Sarah's lungs burned with each breath, her legs heavy from the strain, but she couldn't stop. James ran beside her, his face set in grim determination, while the ever-present sound of the tomb groaning around them pushed them forward. Every few seconds, the ground beneath their feet shuddered, as though Neferkah's curse had infected the very stone. Behind them, the soft, slithering whispers of the shadow echoed, growing louder with each step. They didn't dare look back. "Where's Drake?" Sarah gasped, her voice trembling. The professor had fallen behind after sending James to pull her from that cursed chamber. Now, the tomb's twisting halls and shifting stone made it impossible to tell if he was even alive. James shook his head, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was trying to find another way out, he panted. But this place is a maze. I think it's changing. Sarah didn't argue. The tomb felt like it was alive, shifting beneath their feet, moving to trap them deeper inside. There was no logic to the corridors anymore, just endless tunnels that led them further away from the surface. We're running out of time, James muttered under his breath. The air grew colder as they descended, the light from their torches flickering weakly, barely pushing back the darkness that thickened with every step. Sarah's thoughts raced. The curse was stronger now. It had awoken fully, and it was no longer satisfied with haunting them. It wanted their lives, maybe even their souls. We can't keep running, Sarah whispered, her voice tight with fear. It's not going to let us leave. James slowed, his torch shaking in his hand. Then what do we do? His eyes were wild, desperation leaking into his voice. If we can't escape, then what the hell do we do? Before Sarah could answer, a deafening crack split the air. The ground beneath them trembled violently, and with a horrific rumble, part of the ceiling above them collapsed. They barely had time to leap out of the way as tons of stone crashed down where they had stood moments before, blocking the passage. They were trapped. James staggered backward, his breath coming in panicked gasps. No, 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 we can't be trapped. He turned, pounding on the pile of rubble with his fists, as though he could dig them out by sheer force of will. There has to be another way. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the darkened corridor. The air felt suffocating, like the tomb was closing in around them. And then, in the shadows beyond the rubble, she saw it. Movement. Her pulse quickened as the figure of Neferka appeared, the faint glow of his eyes piercing the darkness. The Pharaoh's shadow had found them. We can't outrun him, Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. He's part of the tomb. We've unleashed something we don't understand. James looked at her, his face contorted with fear and confusion. What are you saying? We're just supposed to give up? No. Sarah's voice steadied, even as fear tightened its grip on her. There has to be something we're missing. Some way to stop the curse. It's not just haunting us. It's trying to protect something. Her mind raced back to the hieroglyphs, to the stories of Pharaoh Neferka, cursed for defying the gods. This wasn't about treasure or revenge. It was about power. Neferka had been entombed with something he wanted to guard for eternity. The curse isn't just to keep us out, Sarah continued, her voice rising with urgency. It's to keep whatever is down here from being discovered. James stared at her, realization dawning on his face. You think there's something deeper? Sarah nodded. If we can find whatever it is Neferka was trying to protect, maybe we can undo the curse. James hesitated, but a loud, rasping breath echoed down the corridor, and Neferka's figure loomed closer, the green glow of his eyes cutting through the blackness. There was no time to question it now. Then we go deeper, James said, his voice resolute. We find whatever it is. They turned and hurried down the remaining passage, the sound of Neferka's steps echoing behind them. The air grew colder still, and as they ran, the walls became more ornate, carved with intricate hieroglyphs, ancient depictions of gods and rituals. Sarah's eyes darted across the symbols, trying to make sense of the story they told. At last, the passage opened into a vast chamber, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. In the center of the room stood an ancient altar, upon which sat a gleaming artifact, a small golden statue of a god, its eyes inlaid with deep, dark gems that glowed faintly in the torchlight. "This is it," Sarah whispered. "This is what he's been protecting." But as they stepped into the chamber, the ground trembled again. Neferka appeared in the doorway, his decayed figure towering over them. His voice, dark and furious, filled the air. "You dare approach the sacred relic, you will pay for your trespass." The room plunged into a deadly cold, and Sarah realized in horror that the curse would not allow them to leave, not without a fight. "We don't have a choice," she whispered, her hand reaching for the relic. "This is our only chance." The moment she touched the statue, the tomb seemed to shudder as though it had taken a breath. The curse had been triggered, and now the final test had begun.